In this episode, we're stepping into a quieter corner of royal history. Not the scandals splashed across headlines, but the slow, stubborn love story of a shy prince and the woman who told him no twice. This is the story of Prince Albert, the man who would become King George VI, and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a woman who feared that marrying into the royal family would cost her the freedom she cherished, and yet in time became the steadying heart of a king and a kingdom. Settle in, make a cup of tea, and let's slip back into the years when their story almost never happened. Before he was King George VI, before he was the steady, quiet figure who guided Britain through war. He was simply Bertie, a shy second son with a stammer, aching nerves, and a heart that chose a woman who told him no twice. Our story begins not in a palace of glittering marble, but in the awkward shadow of an older brother. Bertie was born Prince Albert, the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. His elder brother, David, the future Edward VIII, soaked up the light. David was charming, effortless, the sort of prince who glided into a room and seemed to own it. Bertie did not. He struggled with a stammer that caught on simple words, turning ordinary conversation into a quiet battle. He was anxious in crowds, self-conscious in public, and painfully aware that he was never meant to be king. In a world that valued glittering confidence, Bertie moved carefully, almost apologetically, through his own life. And then he saw her. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon did not fit the typical picture of a future queen either. She was the daughter of the Earl of Strathmore, raised in a large, warm, slightly chaotic aristocratic family. Her childhood was filled with laughter, gardens, muddy shoes, and the easy comfort of a home that was not a palace. She was lively, intelligent, and more attached to her freedom than to any crown. Bertie met Elizabeth at family gatherings and society events, where she moved through rooms with gentle self-assurance. She could be mischievous but never cruel, friendly but never calculating. Where David dazzled, Elizabeth steadied. And for a man like Bertie, whose life felt so often like standing on a shaking floor, that steadiness was magnetic. He fell in love quietly. No dramatic declarations, no grand romantic speeches, just a growing certainty that this woman with her calm eyes and quick smile saw something in him beyond his stammer and his rank. In her presence, he felt less like a nervous prince and more like a man. But to love Elizabeth was to ask her to step into a world she did not entirely trust, because Elizabeth, for all her warmth, saw the royal family up close. She saw the constraints, the endless duties, the crowds, the scrutiny. She knew what it meant to live a life where very little truly belongs to you. And for a woman raised in the relative freedom of the Scottish countryside, that bargain did not feel romantic. It felt like a loss. Even so, Bertie's feelings deepened. He spoke about her to his mother, Queen Mary, and to those closest to him. He watched her at dances, always careful, always respectful, never pushing too hard. But eventually, his heart could not remain entirely unspoken. He decided to propose. There was no fairy tale setting, no orchestra hiding in the bushes, just a quiet prince bracing himself against his own nerves to ask the question that terrified him more than any public speech. He asked Elizabeth to marry him, and she said no. Her refusal was not cruel. It was, in some ways, an act of honesty. Elizabeth told him, in her own gentle way, that she did not wish to become a royal. She did not want the life that came with him, the ceremonies, the constant attention, the duty that never really allowed you to be alone. She feared that in marrying a prince she would lose herself. For Bertie, who had finally dared to hope, it was a quiet devastation. He did not rage, he did not storm. He simply withdrew, carrying his disappointment like a private wound. Those around him saw a change, more withdrawn, more introspective, as if a door inside him had closed. Time passed. Royal life continued its strange rhythm. Public ceremonies, family obligations, the constant watchful presence of the press. But for Bertie, something remained unresolved. He still thought of Elizabeth, not as a fantasy, not as a distant, perfect ideal, but as a real woman he had asked and who had refused for reasons he understood, even as they hurt him. Queen Mary, ever conscious of duty and the importance of marriage, did not entirely let the matter rest. She saw in Elizabeth not just a suitable wife, but a stabilising presence, a woman whose good sense and warmth might be exactly what her anxious son needed. There were gentle suggestions, occasional invitations, arrangements that allowed Elizabeth and Bertie to meet again, and again. And so the dance continued. He, still in love. She, still cautious. Until at last, Bertie tried one more time. He proposed again. And once again, Elizabeth said no. For most men, a second rejection would have been the end of the story. For a prince, it might have been a matter of pride, but for Bertie, it was something quieter and perhaps more painful. He was not only rejected as a suitor, but in his mind as a man who could offer a life worth sharing. Yet even in this second refusal, Elizabeth's reasons did not change. She was not rejecting him. She was rejecting the crown that hovered over his shoulder. She feared the machine of monarchy, its weight, its loss of privacy, its habit of swallowing individuals whole. To choose Bertie was to choose that entire world, and at that moment in her life, she could not. But history is rarely shaped by a single no, and this quiet, stubborn love story was not finished yet. Because while Elizabeth hesitated, other suitors circled. Life moved on. Europe trembled on the edge of change, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a shy prince nursed a love that refused to entirely fade. But sometimes, love is not defeated by a no. It is refined by it. The years between Elizabeth's second refusal and her final answer were not empty. They were filled with quiet moments, encounters at family gatherings, dinner parties where he sat near her, and she noticed how kind he was, how patient, how he never once made her feel foolish for saying no. She watched him grow, not into a dazzling prince, but into something more rare, a man who knew his own weaknesses and did not hide behind charm, a man who stumbled over words, but whose actions spoke more clearly than any speech. And slowly, without either of them quite naming it, Elizabeth began to see Bertie differently. She saw a man who would never try to own her, a man who would let her be herself, even within the walls of a palace. There was also another quiet force at work. Time. The years passed. Other suitors came and went, and somewhere in that passage, Elizabeth realized something. Bertie was still there, not pressing, not demanding, just present, steady. And then, life offered one of its strange, gentle twists. A rival suitor, the man Elizabeth had cared for, left her life as suddenly as he had entered it. It was not a dramatic ending. It was simply over. In the quiet that followed, Elizabeth looked at Bertie, really looked, and she saw what had been there all along. He proposed a third time. This time, there was no hesitation. This time, Elizabeth said yes. She did not choose the crown, she chose the man. And in choosing him, she quietly accepted everything that came with him. The engagement was announced in 1922. It was a calm affair, no scandal, no breathless gossip, just two people who had finally reached the same place at the same time. Queen Mary was pleased. The family exhaled. And Elizabeth, young, lively, independent Elizabeth, stepped toward her new life, with her eyes open. They married in 1923 at Westminster Abbey. The great church was dressed in flowers. Sunlight slipped through high windows, turning dust in the air into something almost holy. Elizabeth walked slowly up the aisle, in satin and pearls, not a reluctant bride, but a woman who had taken her time and still chosen to walk forward. At the altar, Bertie waited, nervous, hands trembling just a little. But when he saw her, the tension in his shoulders eased. This was the woman who had said no, twice, and now she was walking toward him. The vows were simple, promises spoken carefully with the weight of duty and the tenderness of two people who knew how hard this choice had been. A ring, a kiss, and suddenly the shy second son and the girl from the Scottish countryside were husband and wife. But it was after the wedding that their real story began, because it was in the small rooms, not the great halls, that their marriage took shape. They settled first into York Cottage. Not grand, not intimidating. A place where wind rattled the windows and fires crackled in the grates. There, Bertie and Elizabeth built something the public rarely saw. Not a throne, a home. She helped him with his speeches, sitting beside him, marking where he should pause, where a difficult word might be replaced with one his tongue could manage. She did not laugh when he stumbled. She waited, encouraged, tried again with him. He, in turn, gave her room to breathe. She visited her family, kept her easy manner, filled their home with laughter and friends, not just courtiers and protocol. In a world that could have swallowed her, he let her remain herself. They had two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. In the nursery, far from the formal rooms, Bertie seemed to shed years of anxiety. He read bedtime stories, kneeling awkwardly beside small beds. He played on the floor, a future king with toy soldiers and wooden blocks at his feet. Elizabeth watched him there, this gentle, serious man who had once been so afraid of nearly everything. With his daughters, he was simply Papa. And in those quiet domestic scenes, their marriage deepened. Outside their walls, the world shifted. His brother David moved closer to the throne. Whispers grew about a woman named Wallis Simpson. The crown tilted ever so slightly off its expected path. Inside York Cottage, and later at their grander homes, Bertie and Elizabeth could not quite ignore the tension. But they met it as they met everything else, together. When the abdication crisis finally came, and David chose love on his own terms over the crown he had been born to wear, it was Bertie who was left standing in the echo. A man who had never wanted to be king, now asked to carry a kingdom. In those days of fear and uncertainty, one thing did not waver. Elizabeth, the woman who had once refused royal life because she feared it would swallow her, now stood at the side of a man who felt he might drown beneath its weight. She steadied him before speeches, listened to his doubts in the quiet hours, reminded him that he was not alone, that the shy prince who had loved her so steadfastly was now a king with a partner just as steadfast. Together they would face war. Together they would walk through bombed streets, visit shattered homes, stand with their people in their darkest hours. And beneath the crowns, beneath the uniforms and ceremony, remained the simple truth. This was a marriage that almost never happened. Because she said no, twice. But when she finally said yes, their quiet, stubborn love helped steady not only a man, but a monarchy, and, for a time, an entire nation. So in the end, this was never just a royal romance. It was the story of a man who doubted himself, and a woman who took her time before stepping into his world. She feared the crown. She feared the loss of herself. And yet, when she finally chose him, their quiet partnership helped carry Britain through its darkest years. Thank you for wandering through this story with me tonight. From the shy prince who almost never wore the crown, and the woman who almost walked away. May their quiet courage and stubborn love stay with you long after the candles go out.